All right, guys. Day 2 of the Baroque. So we're going to focus a little bit more in depth on two of the painters we talked about yesterday, Caravaggio and Rembrandt, and then we're going to finish up today's notes by talking about Baroque architecture. So again, we have a big difference in Protestants and Catholics at this time. The Protestant Reformation, we talked about this last time, began in 1517, and they broke away from the Catholic Church. So how does this affect art? The Protestants didn't want their churches decorated with paintings, stained glass, or sculpture. They thought it distracted from the worship, so Protestant buildings at the time were going to be bare bones. And then Catholics responded to that with the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent in 1561, and now they said art is going to be less idealized, more humble. So let's look back at this painting from the Renaissance. So this is before the Catholic Church did the Council of Trent. So here we have art with idealistic forms. They're painted like Greek statues. Everything is symmetrical with bright colors and lots of light. Fast forward to this Caravaggio painting. We are now fully in the Baroque style. This is Doubting Thomas from 1603. So the Baroque, post-Council of Trent. So this is after the Catholic Church said, we're still going to paint. We're still going to pay for religious paintings, but now they're going to be more realistic, less idealistic. So we now have a single light source. It looks like there is a spotlight up from the corner shining down on the figures. Everything else is in shadow. Shallow space, meaning that we are zoomed into the scene. Fewer colors. Almost every Baroque painting from the Catholic Church at this time is going to have some sort of drama. Remember, we saw lots of violence. And non-ideal figures. So we'll see realistic, like dirt on the clothes, wrinkled clothes, furrowed brows. Not everybody looks happy all the time. More realistic depictions of reality. Here's another of Caravaggio's paintings. This is the Crucifixion of St. Peter from 1601. So again, Caravaggio worked for the church. Most of his works are currently in churches in Rome. There's also quite a few in Spain. This one hangs in the Sorassi Chapel. Setting the work on a diagonal axis makes it more dramatic, and we'll see more examples of that soon. So you can see the lines of the painting going across. Okay, so let's compare. Here is... This is in the chapel. So there it is right here in this corner of the chapel. And then over here on this other side, we see the conversion of St. Paul that we talked about last class. So here are the diagonal lines. There is nothing that is straight ahead. So this is a new technique from the Baroque. If we compare it with the perspective and axes of the Renaissance, you can see everything in the Renaissance was pointed towards the center. Everything kind of radiated out from that vanishing point because they had just learned how to add depth. So everything was still centered around that vanishing point in the back. But when we get to Baroque, we figured out how to kind of add depth without having that single vanishing point in the background. Also, remember, in the Baroque, we now are adding in tenebrism, which is the sharp, distinct changes in light and dark shapes. So we have that dramatic lighting effect. Compare it to the sfumato and chiaroscuro of the Renaissance, where blending was used. Tenebrism, dramatic difference. There's light on the body, there's shadow behind him. The rejection of Greek influence. So here's a quote by a man named Giovanni Pietro Bellori in reference to Caravaggio. So he's talking about Caravaggio. When he was shown the most famous works of the Greeks, in order that he might use them as models, his only answer was to point toward a crowd of people, saying that nature gave him an abundance of masters. So what does that mean? That means he did not look to the past Greek masters to study technique, but instead he looked to nature and studied real people to make his works more realistic. He's like, I don't need to make my paintings look like ancient Greece and Rome. I need to make my paintings look like real people. So that's what he did. When he came upon someone in town who pleased him, he made no attempt to improve on the creations of nature. So here we see, this is just a painting. It's a cross section. You can see he has dirty feet. He's kneeling. This would have never happened in the Renaissance. You wouldn't have shown dirty clothes, torn clothes, wrinkled clothes, people on their knees, anything like that. He placed his figures in darkness of a closed room with placing a lamp high so that the light would fall straight down, so as to produce that powerful contrast of light and dark, which is tenebrism. Here's the Calling of St. Matthew again from 1600. This hangs in the Contarelli Chapel. So we see that one light source up in that top right corner again. So there it is on that side. So remember that this painting, one of these figures is Christ. One of these figures is St. Peter. But that is why one of the reasons this painting caused so much controversy is because it's not obvious who these saint and Christ-like figures are. There's no halo, they're not the center, they're not the top of a triangle. So this is a more realistic scene of how this would have actually happened, right? So these religious figures are not the focus of the painting. The focus is Matthew. Before becoming a disciple of Christ, he was a tax collector. So he is seen here counting money. Okay, so the most holy people in the painting are not in the middle, not in the light. New thing. Let's compare the depictions of David. So here is a painting of David and Goliath by Caravaggio compared to the statue of David by Michelangelo. Dramatic difference in just the appearance of David himself, not like even removing Goliath and the gore involved in that beheading after the fight. David himself looks more realistic to what a poor farmer would look like at the time, right? It's very unlikely that David was a well-muscled man. They're not well-fed, being poor farmers. So this is a much more realistic portrayal of what he would have looked like as a farmer in the time. All right, so comparing Baroque and Renaissance depictions. Here's another comparison of pre-Renaissance and post-Renaissance. So we have the death of a virgin. So we can see before the Renaissance, there was no perspective. Light was coming from everywhere. These holy angels were marked by their halos around their head. The baby Jesus, still shown as a baby. And then over here in the Baroque, on the right, we have that single light source. People are bowed. People are realistically saddened. They're showing their features, their emotions, much more realistic. Moving on to Rembrandt. So remember, he is our Protestant painter from Holland at the time, now the Netherlands. Holland was a Protestant country, so art was not found in churches, only in private homes. So that's important because that's who he was being paid to paint by. So the merchant class was the patron of arts, not just the royal family and not the church. So we have lots of landscapes, still lifes, and portraits, because if people are paying for a painting, they want it to be of themselves, right? And here's one of his many self-portraits. This is from 1659. Oil is his preferred paint. He's typically dark and monochromatic, meaning he uses very few colors, lit by a direct light source with shallow space. We're in that zoomed in cross-section. He painted the human dramas of wealthy, powerful, proud, hardworking Protestant Dutch merchants. So his is not quite as realistic as other paintings of the Baroque because he is being paid by people to make them look good. Here are some of his. So you can still see all of the characteristics of Baroque art here. So he didn't shy away from showing the wrinkles, but he still had to make people happy with their work, right? The Night Watch we talked about last class. All of those different soldiers welcoming Queen of France. So his later work after the death of his wife became much darker and more somber. So you can see in his face, the brushstrokes got thicker, showing many more lines and tension in his face. All right, so how Baroque art departs from the Renaissance. What are the main ways that Baroque is different? Tenebrism, that dramatic difference in light and dark. Diagonal axes, non-idealistic human portrayals, showing people as they are. Shallow space, so we're zooming into the scene to get up close and personal. Monochromatic, meaning there are fewer colors. And then dramatic, realistic subjects. Okay, moving on to architecture. Again, we have the difference between Protestant architecture and Catholic architecture. So when the Protestants separated themselves from the Catholic Church during the Reformation, the Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation. Protestants felt that art and excess distracted from worship. It was a distraction from the purpose of the church, so it had little place. The Catholics responded to this by trying to attract new worshipers with great works of art and architecture. They viewed the glorification of the physical church as an extension of the glorification of God. So we have two different pathways here when creating architecture. Here are some examples. So, Baroque architecture. Anything from 1600 to 1750 is considered in that Baroque style, mostly in Italy, Spain, Germany, Austria, France, and England. So most of the Western European countries. Our big names are Bernini. We've already talked about him with his sculpture of David. We have Borromini, Wren, Van Brugh, and Lavaux. So what makes something Baroque architecture? The style is massive, opulent, and colorful. So if you can add more stuff to it, it's just extra. It's just extra. You can make it bigger and more extra, then they do it. We have broken contours, dramatic vistas, so all kinds of outdoor additions, lavish ornaments. So instead of just a column, they're going to add carvings onto it. They're going to add gold onto it. They're going to add extra gargoyles and sculpture and paint. Anything they can add on it, they're going to lavish it. So who is paying for it? Absolute monarchs, kings, and the Catholic Church. We see a fusion of architecture and sculpture by adding on sculpture to the architecture itself. A creation of the total environment for environmental effect. So we'll see this specifically when we look at the Palace of Versailles here in a second. Serpentine columns, meaning instead of straight up and down columns, we now have serpentine, wavy line columns. Architecture affirmed the power of people with absolute authority. The structures and decorative programs of palaces, churches, government buildings, scientific and commercial buildings, and installations. So it was expanding outside of the church and the royalty. So here we have those serpentine columns. It's not just a straight up and down, it's wavy. See, it's not just bronze or marble or concrete or stone. It is several materials mixed together. So we have the black inlaid with the gold. We have all kinds of carvings, details, like it's not just go straight. It goes up into these little knobs with these Corinthian flowers. And then we have it's never simple. Never. Okay, all kinds of stuff. All right, so when we're looking at macro scale, the big buildings, Renaissance architecture. So here we have Brunelleschi's dome in Florence that we talked about in the Renaissance. Figured out the engineering of making buildings larger. Okay, so in the Renaissance, they were like, we know how to build big domes now. Then the Baroque was like, all right, we know how to build big domes. Let's add on to it. So they added on all of these extra decorations. So we have more spires. We have all these extra little temples at the top, bigger domes, fancier columns, right? So Renaissance architecture focused on engaging the intellect with what they call divine geometry, right? Making things symmetrical, while the Baroque architecture wanted to overwhelm your senses. Baroque architecture mastered the unification of visual art. So we have architecture, sculpture, and painting all working together in Baroque art. So here are some examples of that in furniture. So it's not just a table. It's the gods, the Greek and Roman gods holding up a table that's been inlaid with gold, that opens up to a clock, that has a sculpture of a bird, like all these extra details. Every single bit of space was covered. There was no blank space to be found on Baroque furniture. Okay, so if they could fit a design on it, it had one. The walls were no longer just walls. We now have decorative walls. All right, so what are some adjectives you can use to describe these pieces? What come to mind are ornate, lots of ornamentation, lots of decoration on them. Intricate, lots of fine details. Detailed. Gilded, so gilded means that it is covered with gold whenever possible. All right, so we're going to take a look at 3 examples of Baroque architecture. We're going to start with St. Paul's Cathedral, which is in London, still there today, designed by Sir Christopher Wren. Let's take a look. So we still see the big dome.
Designed by the architect Sir Christopher Wren and completed in 1710, St Paul's Cathedral has been one of the most familiar sights of the London skyline for over 3 centuries. The previous St Paul's burnt down in the Great Fire of London in 1666, but a bigger, more impressive building emerged from the ashes. After the fire, Wren wanted to build a monument to the revived city of London.
So we see the sculptures coming out of the architecture here.
Charles II, and of course, to the glory of God. The building became more than just a monument to faith, it also became a monument to science and innovation, an engineering marvel of the age. Wren wanted to make the cathedral's dome in proportion to the building from the inside, but from the outside, large enough to dominate the city skyline. The answer was to build 2 separate and distinct structures.
Just like the Florence Dome.
Inside the cathedral, it appears that there is just one dome. But in fact, this is the inner dome, and above it is a separate outer dome, built on top of the inner dome. These 2 domes were architectural wonders of their age, and remain one of the most recognizable landmarks of the city today.
All right, still there. You can visit it whenever we're allowed to travel again. Here are some pictures of it during, I think this is after World War II. So it is remarkably been not damaged again since that fire in the 1600s. So it evaded the bombs of the Nazis during World War II. So quite remarkable. There's some of the inside of it. You can see all those ornate details. All right, moving on to Palace of Versailles. So this is in Versailles, France, just outside of Paris, designed by Louis Lavaux.
The French glory, the palace and park of Versailles. Louis XIV built the Palace of Versailles 20 kilometers outside Paris on what was a dense stretch of forest. 300 years on, the monument is preserved as a World Heritage Site and is one of the glories of France. King's suite included the king's bedchamber. His life was a ritual in itself. The only time he had to himself was when he was asleep. When he woke at 7 in the morning ritual began. More than 100 people looked on from behind this gilded wall.
All the gold, all the details.
This was the clock used to mark out the royal routine. One of the great attractions for visitors is the Hall of Mirrors. At the time, mirrors were precious. The hall was used for ceremonies and grand balls. The king's favourite place on the estate, though, was the garden, which has a symmetrical design, and also 1,400 fountains. The water came from the Seine River and was stored in reservoirs located on the tops of buildings. There are more than 30 kilometers of water pipes underground. The fountains have an abundant water supply, using water pressure caused by water flowing from a higher level. The original water supply system is still in use.
That's fascinating.
Back inside the palace, there is a special clock. It was made especially for Louis XIV. The king's symbol, the sun, appears. visitors can hear time ticking away exactly as the Sun King did 3 centuries ago.
All right, one last example. So we've seen one in England, we've seen one now in France. Here's some more pictures of the inside of the Hall of Mirrors. You can see just how gold and intricate it is. This is the Queen's bed. All right, last one. We are now talking about Escorial Palace from San Lorenzo, Spain, designed by Juan de Toledo. If you look here, you can see the floor plan, the blueprint, like if you're looking down on it from the sky. It was designed after a grill that a saint was flayed alive on.
We're side-tripping a short drive into the hills from Madrid to San Lorenzo de El Escorial. The town has charm, but everybody visits for this, its sprawling palace. In the mid-1500s, King Philip II needed a suitably grand palace to establish his family dynasty, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. He also needed a headquarters from which to run a strong, centralized Spanish state. Philip ruled his huge empire, which stretched from Mexico to Manila from here. El Escorial was built during the Reformation, a time when Catholic Spain was defending the church against Protestant heretics. The enigmatic, introverted, and extremely Catholic King Philip II directed the Counter-Reformation from this spot. Today, it's packed with history and art, offering an evocative trip back to Spain's most fascinating age. El Escorial was more than an impressive palace for a divine monarch. It was a grand mausoleum for Spain's royal family. It was a monastery to provide constant prayer for the king's soul. And it was a religious school designed to teach and embrace humanism in a way that fit the Catholic faith. King Philip built in austerity, plain white walls, and bare bones chandeliers. His simple bed, with a mattress that's not even queen size, came with a view of the high altar in the basilica just next door. The basilica, the architectural and spiritual heart of the complex, is dedicated to the martyr St. Lawrence. The altar features a painting of the flame-engulfed grill with St. Lawrence meeting his fiery death. Downstairs, the royal pantheon is the gilded resting place of 4 centuries of Spanish kings and queens. There's a strict filing system. The first and greatest, Charles V, and his queen, flank the altar on the top shelf. Their son, Philip II, rests below Charles and opposite his wife, and so on. Because kings might have married more than once, to make it here, a woman needed to be both queen and mother of a king. The immense library shows that knowledge was a priority for the Spanish royalty. The ceiling celebrates the 7 classical disciplines with a burst of color. The elaborate model, constructed after the age of Copernicus, insists on proving that the solar system revolves unmistakably around the Earth. As you leave, a plaque above the door warns you'll be excommunicated if you take a book without checking it out. Who needs late fees when you hold the keys to eternal damnation?
All right, so you can see through those 3 palaces that even though these were all built in the Baroque time, that they all have, or not 2 palaces and a church, all have differences based on where they were. So it's not going to be identical everywhere. All right, cool stuff.